Hey everybody, welcome back to iHeart Stats. This is the end of week 2, and I hope you're doing well and you're sticking with us. There's a couple things that came up in the message boards this week that I just wanted to go back and reinforce to make sure everybody's clear about them. The first one is that the idea of central tendency is to find some value that's in the middle of all the data that we have that's the best possible representation of that data set. Now that's hard to do when the data is spread out all over the place, so central tendency often doesn't tell us the whole story, but it's one way of representing the data set in a clear way that tells us something about kind of what the center of things is, what's the middle, what's the kind of characteristic of the data. All right, so that's the idea of central tendency. That comes into play in particular because sometimes the central tendency calculation that we made for the mean or for the median works better or worse depending on what the data looks like. The more spread out the data is, the less good any measure of central tendency is. But there's specific kinds of things, character of the data, that can make it even worse for certain measures. The mean, for example, is much more sensitive to extreme values than the median. Okay, so if you have some data point where you've got all of the numbers are kind of clustered around 20 or something, and then you've got one person who's got a score of 250, that one data point is going to draw that mean up a long ways just because of that one person. And so the mean is much more sensitive to those kind of extreme values. Either extreme high values or extreme low values can really affect the mean a great deal. And so you have to be careful when you have extreme values in your data and you're using the mean, because it can start to look like something that's not really what the data is about. The data is really about around 20, and you've got this one person with a score of 250 that's probably pulling the mean up to 30 or 35 or 40 or something, and that 40 number isn't characteristic of the data at all. That can happen when you have extreme values. In those cases, it's better to use the median, because the median, that extreme case, you don't use the actual number, it's just another one at the top, and so it doesn't move the median as much as it would if you were calculating a mean. Okay? When you're doing, point number 2, when you're doing a median, don't forget you've got to put the numbers in order from lowest to highest in order to figure out which one is the center one. If you just put them in random order, 3, then 10, then 21, then 17, then 2, then 5, the one that's in the middle doesn't mean anything. You've got to put them in order first. 2, then 3, then 4, then 6, then 8, then 17, then 24, then 36. You've got to put them in order first and then pick the middle one, and that'll tell you something about what the center of that data is about. That's the second thing. The last thing I wanted to mention today is that several people have sort of grasped onto the idea of the mean deviation, and they like it and it makes sense to them. I agree with you. It does make sense, and it tells you something about the data that's very sensible. But then we tried to move you onto this thing called the standard deviation. It was more complicated, and it's not as intuitively obvious what that tells you about the data. But it's important that we decide to you should actually heart the standard deviation, because the way that's calculated does a lot of extra work for us in the next few chunks of the course, and it's related to some very important statistical concepts that help us do things in a way that gives us a lot more information than the mean deviation can do. Okay, so the mean deviation is a nice concept, but the standard deviation is something that has a lot more power, and if you can just hold on for another course, a class or two, then I think you'll start to see why how the standard deviation works more for us. So if you can just kind of put that on hold until you see the next chunk, I think you'll start to understand why we like the standard deviation so much and why we use it more than we do the mean deviation. Okay, that's it for this time. Hope you're doing well, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module of iHeart Stats.